Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am back. This is Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection Part B for the Wild Wild Corner lecture. It is 3:46 p.m. I am in Miami-Dade County, Florida. I may have to raise or project my voice from time to time. Please adjust your volumes accordingly. I am outdoors. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for your patronage. We are here to discuss further the political conundrum that the Cuban state poses to the United States. I'm going to read from a document entitled Cuba's Continuous Support for Terrorism. This document was drafted by the Cuban Studies Institute, and the document is approximately 6 pages long, not terribly long. Let's see. All right, so this is the first paragraph. It says, in addition to its proven technical prowess to interfere and intercept U.S. telecommunications, excuse me, and mind you, I'm reading directly from the document here. Cuba has deployed around the world a highly effective human intelligence network. The type of espionage carried out by Ana Belén Montes, the senior U.S. defense intelligence analyst who spied for Cuba during some 16 years until her arrest in 2001, has enabled the Castro regime to amass a wealth of intelligence on U.S. vulnerabilities, as well as a keen understanding of the inner workings of the U.S. security system. Such information and analysis are being provided to strategic allies like Iran. While one may argue that factors such as Iran's limited military capabilities and sheer distance diminishes any conventional concerns, one should expect that Tehran, in case of a U.S.-Iran conflict, will launch an asymmetrical offensive against the U.S. and its European allies through surrogate terrorist states and paramilitary organizations. In such a scenario, Cuban intelligence would be invaluable to Iran and its proxies, and Cuban territory could be used by terrorist groups to launch operations against the U.S. So basically, what that page is saying is that among the many concerns that the United States has about Cuba, particularly with its capacity and its propensity to side with states, well, not necessarily side with state sponsors of terrorism, but actually commit and orchestrate state-sponsored acts of terrorism. The sort of underlying fear is that Cuba would, or already has, gotten in contact with Iran with respect to stimulate Iran's capacity to be an aggressor by strengthening surrogate terrorist states and organizations, meaning not necessarily those based in Iran, but those based in other countries that may support Iran. So what the U.S.'s intelligence community is asserting with this assertion is that the intelligence that the Cuban government has access to. Okay, particularly its Central Directorate of Intelligence. That in case of a conflict between the United States and Iran, that Cuba will almost definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, side with Iran. And that would make two enemies for the U.S. instead of one. So that's sort of the underlying fear that the U.S. has with Cuba, is that it is by proxy an ally of Iran, and that it is essentially an ally of Iran by proxy because they share a political philosophy, and that political philosophy is communism. So, and then here's a bullet point list that says, following is recent evidence of Cuba's involvement with terrorism. It says, Cuba directly through Venezuela continues to provide intelligence to Hamas and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, on orders of Hassan Nasrallah, set up an operational base in Cuba, working in coordination with the Cuban government. Venezuela is promoting Hezbollah and Iranian targets in South America and against the U.S. They fundraise for Hezbollah, facilitate travels for Hezbollah activists to Venezuela, and through Venezuela to other countries. This is all part of the strategic alliance between Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran. Cuban military officers are acting as liaisons between Venezuelan military and the narco guerrillas of the Colombian FARC. General Leonardo Ramon Adolo, Chief Operations of the Cuban Ministry of the Armed Forces, has visited Venezuela several times and has acted as a go between the Cuban and Venezuelan military involved in drug trafficking. And on May 19, 2019, the Panamanian Naval Services announced that they confiscated thousands of packages of cocaine hidden in carbon bags that were originated in Cuba and destined for Turkey. So I'll stop right there, ladies and gentlemen, and just tell you that this list, this bullet point list, is a very definitive, very no-nonsense, very accurate, and very consequential list. Okay, this is a list not to be argued with. This list is based on at least a decade of CIA and Department of Defense investigations into Cuba's terrorist activity. And it gets very much into detail with why the United States has sort of had this off again situation going with Cuba, where once every 4 or 5 years it goes back on the state sponsors of terrorism list. Okay, there's a reason for that. And this bullet point is a very definitive list for those reasons. So it's saying basically that Venezuela serves as a mediator, a geographic mediator between Cuba, Hamas, and Hezbollah. So Cuba essentially sends materials, resources, etc., support through Venezuela to Hamas and Hezbollah. And Hamas and Hezbollah are groups that have been at war with Israel. Well, it's kind of been a war of attrition with Israel for going on 20 years now at least, in heightened levels. And this war has seen a lot of bloodshed. This war has seen a lot of catastrophe. And this war rages on in the names of prophets. Okay, the Jews have their prophets, the Muslims have their prophets, and there's a clash, an ideological clash happening in the Middle East right now between the Muslim and Jewish political factions over land. The land of Israel was promised to the Jews by their prophets. The land of Israel was promised to the Palestinians by their prophets. Each side believes it has a divine right to the land of Israel. But quite frankly, when it really comes down to it, neither side has internationally recognized land deeds for that area. This is a survival of the fittest battle. What's going to happen is this: the side with the better firepower is going to win, and that's going to be the end of the conflict. But what the United States is saying is this: ultimately, we just don't want to see Cuba join Hezbollah and Hamas. Cuba's 100 miles off our shores. We don't want to see them joining Hezbollah and Hamas. A country that close to the U.S., 100 miles, we don't want to see them joining Hezbollah and Hamas. That's what the U.S. is saying. But ultimately, Cuba is just basically saying, we'll do as we please. We'll do as the communist global community wants. And we're going to essentially operate as we see fit in the interest of our own state and our own alliances. And what it looks like is Cuba is coordinating with Venezuela to organize fundraisers for Hezbollah and Hamas. Okay? Ideological differences happen, ladies and gentlemen. There's no way to stop people from disagreeing on politics. Okay? Here's the concern. It's because Hezbollah and Hamas have armies that have the capacity to affect societies positively or negatively, depending on how they apply their human capital. Okay, Hamas is the government of the Palestinian Authority. Hezbollah is an armed insurgent group that has the capacity to dislike U.S. and Israeli involvement in Middle Eastern affairs. Okay, ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, I think that as the days, months, and years go by, I think that the state of Israel is going to have more of a concern about Cuban involvement in narco-terrorism. I think that Israel will eventually look at Cuba and say, now wait just a minute now. After what happened a couple of years ago in October and the military offensive that we've carried out since then, and the various diplomatic concerns that we've had, and this and that and the third, everything we've done since the October date. Okay, is going down in history. And whether you agree or disagree with it, it's going down in history indeed. And ultimately, what's happening here is you're having an all-out annihilation contest, and the contest is one of attrition. Okay, this isn't World War III. What we have here are a very bitterly divided Jewish and Muslim situation in the Middle East. And what this institute here is asserting, the Cuban Institute, is that Cuba is assisting actively the enemies of Israel. Now, that's essentially what this bullet point is asserting. Wow. We'll go on to the next page. It's the Panamanian Naval Services announced that they confiscated thousands of packages of cocaine hidden in carbon bags that originated in Cuba and were destined for Turkey. The FBI estimates that Cuba has provided safe harbor to dozens of fugitives from U.S. who live on the island under the protection of the Castro regime. Some of these fugitives are charged or have been convicted of murder, kidnapping, and hijacking. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to continue on, actually. They include notorious killers of police officers in New Jersey and New Mexico, most prominently of them Johann Chesimard, also known as Assata Shakur, placed by the FBI in 2013 on the most wanted list. The FBI is offering $2 million for information leading to her apprehension. I believe she was apprehended since the writing of this article. So essentially, and I'm going to paraphrase some of this. Maybe I need to hold on. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am back. Excuse the brief pause and interruption. We are going to start back at the top. On May 19th, 2019, the Panamanian Naval Services announced that they confiscated thousands of packages of cocaine hidden in carbon bags that originated in Cuba and were destined for Turkey. The FBI estimates that Cuba has provided safe harbor to dozens of fugitives from U.S. justice who live on the island under the protection of the Castro regime. Some of these fugitives are charged with or have been convicted of murder, kidnapping, and hijacking. And they include notorious killers of police officers in New Jersey and Mexico, most prominent among them Johann Chesimard, which was placed by the FBI in 2013 on the most wanted terrorist lists. The FBI is offering $2 million for information leading to her apprehension. Other terrorist fugitives of the U.S. living in Cuba include Ismail Labit, one of the 5 men convicted in the infamous Fountain Valley Massacre, a racially tinged 1972 armed robbery in the Virgin Islands that turned into mass murder with 8 dead. Guillermo Morales, the master bomb maker of the Puerto Rican separatist group, FALN, which set off 140 so blasts around the United States during the 1970s and 80s. So this particular page, these 3 bullet points here, illustrate 3 key points, and that's that the Panamanian Naval Services, that's the naval services of the country Panama, confiscated thousands of packages of cocaine hidden in carbon bags that originated in Cuba and were destined for Turkey. So I mean, that's pretty cut and dry. There was some cocaine that some cocaine bags that originated in Cuba by way of Bolivia, Colombia, and Nicaragua, and it was destined for a Turkish dope dealer, and it was confiscated. Pretty cut and dry. The FBI believes that Cuba has provided safe harbor to fugitives, which has been a huge reason that Cuba keeps finding itself on the international sponsors of terrorist list. It harbors fugitives from justice that have been convicted of terrorist actions, and of the most serious nature: murder, kidnapping, hijacking. All right, there was a guy that killed a police officer in New Jersey and New Mexico, and there were other people who committed mass murders in the United States that found refuge in Cuba, who would refuse to extradite them to the United States for sentencing and incarceration. So there's also apparently a bomb maker named Guillermo Morales, who was a Puerto Rican separatist. He set off 140 bombs around the United States in the 1970s and 80s. And Cuba offered him sanctuary in their country. So actions like that make the U.S. skeptical of Cuba. There's another one, Victor Gerena, an armed robber working for another Puerto Rican separatist group, who is believed to have taken the proceeds of a $7 million heist to Cuba with him. Pretty cut and dry. He basically robbed a number of banks to the tune of $7 million and took the money to Cuba, and was protected there by the government. You got Charles Hill, who in 1971 hijacked a civilian plane carrying 49 passengers and fled to Cuba. This man was also wanted for the 1971 murder of New Mexico State Police Officer Robert Rosenblum. Frank Turple, a former CIA officer and convicted arms trafficker, who was wanted for providing more than 20 tons of plastic explosives to the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Others include William Lee Brent, William Potts, and Ronald Labite, all wanted in the U.S. So it gives you more of a rundown of the kinds of fugitives from justice that the Cuban state has safeguarded. And I mean, there are people of every terrorist background. You have bomb makers, you got mass murderers, you got armed robbers, you got heist men that steal millions of dollars, you got people hijacking civilian planes and flying it to Cuba. You got cop killers and CIA officers turned arms dealers. A guy that used his knowledge as a CIA officer to provide 20 tons of plastic explosives to Muammar Gaddafi, who his beliefs were he was a pan-African, pro-communist, anti-American. Muammar Gaddafi was. And apparently there was some sort of a regime change element that took place in Libya, and he was ousted and eventually murdered by a number of coup d'etat players. And that was the end of his reign. But I mean, there are criminals of all kinds who have fled to Cuba and gotten sanctuary in exchange for cash. You got current and former Spanish members of the Basque Fatherland and Liberty, a Basque terrorist organization that continues to reside in Cuba. While some of these terrorists are on an island as a part of an accord between the Cuban and Spanish governments, others are hiding in Cuba, fugitives of Spanish justice. The ETA terrorist Jose Angel Urtiaga Martinez has lived in Cuba since the 1980s and is wanted by Spanish justice. In addition, there are about a dozen other ETA members living in Cuba. In mid-2013, the Castro regime was caught smuggling weapons out of Cuba on a North Korean vessel in violation of UN sanctions. Cuba lied to the international community about the content of the vessel. The official UN report on Cuba, North Korea illegal weapons trafficking, published in March 2014, revealed a comprehensive planned strategy to conceal the existence and nature of the cargo. The report concluded, contrary to Cuba's allegations, that some, if not all, of the consignment was not expected to be returned to Cuba. So it's talking some more about some of the unscrupulous activities that the Cuban government is seen by the U.S. as having a hand in. So it says here that there were ETA Spaniard terrorists who have escaped justice from Spain, from the Spanish government, and resided in Cuba. There are at least, I guess, 13 other members living there from that same ETA terrorist organization. The Castro regime smuggled weapons out of Cuba on a North Korean vessel. That was in violation of UN sanctions on both Cuba and North Korea. So, as I've said in this very lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you a recollection, or I'll help you recall. Communist countries have their allies' best interest at heart, just like capitalist countries have their allies' best interests at heart. In my estimation, this, ladies and gentlemen, if the North Koreans were lending Cuba, the government of Cuba, ships by which to smuggle weapons from Cuba into North Korea, as far as I'm concerned, that's their business. I don't really see militarily, okay, me personally, having observed these things in some depth, I don't personally see Cuba or North Korea as military threats to the U.S. in and of themselves. Of course, they have arsenals, but those arsenals are not as comprehensive as the U.S. arsenals, the U.S. military arsenals. So, me personally, if I'm looking at this situation and I see Cuban sailors commandeering a North Korean ship. Okay. Even if that ship has weapons on it, I'm not terribly concerned about that. I mean, what do they have? A few $100 million worth of aircrafts and missiles on that ship. You see, it's not, for me, it's not a huge concern. I mean, if there is a concern, make it known. Make it known to your media. All right? Make it known to your Spanish-speaking ally nations. And see if they can't get some dialogue going on with Cuba as to why its citizens, its military personnel are driving a North Korean boat out of Cuba that has weapons on it. If that's your concern. Cuba and North Korea have been allies for 60 years now. So if they decide between themselves to do a weapons deal, I mean, that is two communist countries doing international commerce. It's not, for me, a concern to the point where you sense an attack or a threat or anything that resembles terrorism. I'm just simply not quite convinced that in itself is a cause for concern. The U.S. does the same thing. The U.S. buys and sells arms from allied nations all the time. That's between the U.S. and its allies. In my estimation, this transaction between North Korea and Cuba was between them. But that was a violation of UN sanctions on both countries. Now keep in mind, Cuba and North Korea have always been sort of outsiders with respect to UN business. Cuba and North Korea have always been on the U.S.'s watch list as potential adversaries. So, the U.S. has a lot of sway in the United Nations, and communist countries are the minority in the United Nations. So these types of decisions to put sanctions on either Cuba or North Korea, if coming from the United Nations, is, I mean, it's the pastor singing to the choir, really, on the part of the U.S. and its allies, many of which are in the United Nations. So this is not me saying that I don't believe that the Cuban state is a state sponsor of terrorism or narco-terrorism, because I do. But it comes from a place of infractions that could happen here on the homeland, as opposed to sort of an Axis alliance like Nazi Germany had with Benito Mussolini and the Emperor Hirohito. Okay, I don't see it as that type of alliance. I see it as a strategic alliance between communist partners. Okay, and as I said in previous lectures, ladies and gentlemen, you simply cannot stop countries from investigating one another. You cannot stop countries from arming themselves in case of an international conflict. But what I can say is this, ladies and gentlemen, with respect to this situation, Cuba and North Korea, okay, so the international sanctions were violated. Cuba lied about what was on the vessel. Okay, it was aircrafts and missiles. Essentially there was a UN report on this called Cuba and North Korea illegal weapons trafficking. All of the weapons were not to be returned to Cuba. I'm not sure where they were to be sent. It doesn't say here, but it could have been North Korea, it could have been China, it could have been Russia. All communist countries, all friends of Cuba. Okay, in my mind, there's nothing illegal about communist countries doing business with each other. I don't think that should be a threat to the United States. Okay, because quite frankly, capitalism, if you look at the role that the federal government, state governments, and local governments play in capitalist commerce, I mean, the government is so involved in the marketplace and in investments and fair competition and fair trade practices and intellectual property and legal matters that, I mean, free enterprise is only as free as the government allows it to be. Which is not, I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad or good thing. I mean, I think the American economy is traditionally stable. You know, it's got the boom and bust, the bust cycle situation going on, where sometimes you see periods of economic regression. But the U.S. economy is typically on the upside. So I think capitalism has worked well in the United States, although it isn't true capitalism. Like libertarians, for example, a libertarian would say this isn't true capitalism. But a Democrat or a Republican might say this is true capitalism. Okay, I mean, me personally, I think the United States is as capitalist as it could possibly be. Okay, I think that there has to be government regulation in the U.S. markets and in U.S. medical care and in the U.S. Retail establishment and architectural investment sector. All right, these things matter. Okay, these things matter, and I think that the U.S. and some of its allies have made capitalism work for them. Just like China, Russia, North Korea, and on down the list, Vietnam, etc., have made capitalism work for them. Or, excuse me, communism work for them. Some countries have made capitalism work. Some countries have made communism work. I don't think that all capitalist countries in an alliance doing business with each other is evil. I don't think communist countries in alliance with each other doing business is evil. It's simply part of the global economy that we live in. There are different political dynamics in different parts of the world. There are different political philosophies in different parts of the world. So you have different governments in different parts of the world. Me personally, I believe I could thrive in either a capitalist or a communist country. For me, there's no difference. It's all about the application of oneself that matters. Okay? Ultimately, we're going to keep moving. Former Cuban intelligence official Humberto Mario has described how the Castro regime is training Venezuelan Tupamaros, pro-Maduro groups who violently attack Venezuelan students. We'll stop there. We'll read these bullet point by bullet point. That's what we'll do. Rather than read the whole page and do a point-by-point analysis, we'll examine each bullet point independently. So former Cuban intelligence official Humberto Mario has said that he's basically a turncoat. The U.S. attorneys refer to this man as a snitch. He used to work for the Castro government, and now he's turned on the Castro government and is talking about how Castro is training Venezuelan Tupamaros. Pro-Maduro groups who violently attack Venezuelan students. You'll know Maduro's name because he was in the news recently. His government was toppled and he was captured, and power was transferred to his successor, who was a female politician. I don't have her name right in front of me. However, But Maduro had a reputation for doing some atrocious stuff as the president of Venezuela. You got Hezbollah in Cuba. It's a Hamas-funded Turkish charity known as IAH Countries to operate in Havana. IHH is a member of the Union of Good, an umbrella organization that financially supports Hamas. So we see this Hezbollah in Cuba situation is basically a Hamas-funded charity that operates in Havana. It's a member of the Union of Good. So, I mean, this sounds like a charitable organization. And yes, Hamas, Hezbollah, some of these, the Palestinian National Authority, some of these these governmental groups and semi-governmental groups that have been labeled by the United States and some of its allies as terrorist groups, some of these groups do have charitable organizations that they put together. All right. I'm not sure what the millions or billions of currency that these charity groups give away to people around the world, or what the cause of the charity is, or what they offer. But it's probably like most charities where there's a specific cause, and there's a tendency to donate goods to impoverished people. Some of these groups that are seen as terrorist in nature, some of them do some good in the world. You know, I had a college professor once that said, you know, a lot of people that do terrorism are misguided. They're misguided. They're misguided by their family. They're misguided by their communities. They're misguided by their teachers. They're misguided by their clergymen. I had a college professor say that in class. And it made a whole lot of sense. I mean, I think that if a person is born into this world knowing nothing but himself, and at some point somebody or a group of people or even a community indoctrinate that child with the means and the know-how by which to govern his own life, and the knowledge that they receive consists of beliefs and violent actions to bring about political change. If a person is taught that this doctrine, this political doctrine, is the truth, and that person goes into an insurgent organization thinking that that is the way to political change in the country and no other way, then they might become a terrorist actor and do some things that the U.S. might deem as a terrorist activity. And that person could wind up being arrested for terrorism. Although most of the time, people who do acts of terrorism are not arrested. They are sought out and they are killed on sight. And oftentimes, their co-conspirators are blown up with a F-22 fighter missile somewhere in their home country. And we see those images on our local news. We see those images on our cable news. And the caption reads, "These are terrorists being blown up by American airmen. Now, if Cuba is in any way affiliated with such a group, it's going to raise some eyebrows in the American executive office of the president. There's just no way around it. Managed by Cubans in Venezuela, sympathetic to Cuba, Venezuela's immigration system, Mission Identidad, facilitates the entry of Cuban agents into Venezuela. Cubans also control CIME, which is Servicio de Identificación, Migración y Extranjería, Caracas, which facilitates the travel of drug organizations. Cuban guerrillas and Islamic terrorists, Colombian guerrillas and Islamic terrorists. Cuba also has on the island duplicate Venezuelan forms and stamps to issue passports and identifications to these groups. Warranting the special mention are the outstanding U.S. indictments against Cuban Air Force pilots Lorenzo Alberto Perez and Francisco Perez and General Ruben Martinez Puente, the head of the Cuban Air Force, who in 1996 shot down 2 unarmed civilian American aircrafts on international waters in the Florida Straits. That act of terrorism, ordered by Fidel and Raul Castro, killed 4 men, 3 of them American citizens. The Castro brothers personally accepted responsibility for the shutdown. So basically, with that bullet point, they're talking about the Hamas-funded Turkish charity Hezbollah in Cuba is managed by Cubans and Venezuelans. And similarly, this immigration system, Mission Identidad, facilitates the entry of Cuban immigrants into Venezuela. And then Cubans also control the XIII, which facilitates narco traffic. So Venezuela has an immigration system where Cuban agents, or rather agents of the Cuban government, can migrate comfortably into Venezuela with little effort. And there's also Cuba's capacity to facilitate drug trafficking through its identification and migration service. So it looks like Venezuela and Cuba, according to this document, have immigration services that are meant to facilitate black market activity and black market activity alone. So there were a number of fighter pilots that apparently one of which shot down an unarmed civilian American aircraft. It was ordered by Fidel and Raul Castro. It killed 4 people. That's another act of terrorism that the United States keeps on its radar, to keep Cuba on the terrorism list, the state-sponsored terrorism list. Next bullet point: in 2013, Prensa Islamica published an article on Cuba-Iran's growing relationship. The article explains that Cuba has shared with Iran its vast knowledge on intelligence and has discussed cooperation on electromagnetic weapons capable of sabotaging enemy communications. Okay, so there was a magazine called Prensa Islamica, which is about Cuba and Iran's growing relationship. And that Cuba has shared with Iran its vast knowledge on intelligence. And there's a co-op on electromagnetic weapons that can intercept and even destroy enemy communication. So just basically the exchange of weapons technology and weapons technology ideas. I mean, a lot of this weapons technology originates in the US or Europe. A lot of it originates in China and Russia. A lot of it originates in Australia. I mean, every country in the world has electromagnetic weapons that can be used to attack spectrums, communicative spectrums like radio signals, walkie-talkie signals, cellular signals, etc., satellite signals. All these things can be intercepted. But these same electromagnetic weapons, if pointed at a person, can cause that person a great deal of pain and suffering physically. So they're twofold weapons. They can intercept communications and they can harm actual people. So in January 2019, Colombia's president asked Cuba to extradite several leaders of Colombian terrorist group Ejército de Liberación Nacional. Yet Cuba refuses. Living in the island are Israel Ramirez Pineda, Victor Orlando Cabides, Manuel Gustavo Martinez, Consuelo Tapias, Thomas Garcia, Isabel Torres, Juan de Dios, Lizarazo Astrayosa, Amanda Parales, Vivian Haneo, Nicolas Rodriguez Batista, Oscar Serrano. And it's essentially these leaders of this Colombian terrorist group were living in Colombia. We're living in Cuba. And what it's saying here is that Cuba is offering safe haven to these Colombian terrorists. Furthermore, there are other leaders that are also being harvested. This time from the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia. You have Ivan Marquez, Jesus Santric, and Rodrigo Martinez Sosa, who has been a member of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia for decades, as have all of these people, and Cuba's safeguarding them. You got Rodrigo Londoño Echeverri. I mean, you have all kinds of narco terrorists from other countries living in Cuba right now. So we also have the electromagnetic cyber attacks against U.S. and Canadian diplomats in Havana that harmed a number of them, which is still an unresolved issue. So in an attempt to obtain unilateral concession from the U.S., General Raul Castro's regime has toned down some of the violent anti-U.S. propaganda of older brother Fidel. Yet his commitments to and interrelationships with anti-American terrorist groups have not disappeared. They have taken a more sophisticated approach many times, using proxies such as Venezuela supporters. Now, what these last few bullet points are getting at is this: simply that Cuba is harboring Colombia, is giving sanctuary to Colombian terrorists. Cuba was behind the Havana Syndrome attacks, in which U.S. and Canadian diplomats were attacked with directed energy weapons of an electromagnetic nature. All right, we're going to stop part B there, and we are going to pick it up in the near future with part C.